55% of the world's traded cereals and soybeans pass through a handful of narrow waterways before reaching their destination. Most people assume those waterways will stay open, and that assumption held up for decades. But the events of the last 4 years prove it was always a fragile bet. One strait handles 20% of all seaborne crude oil and a third of global fertilizer exports. Another saves ships 2 full weeks of transit and up to 9,000 kilometers of open ocean. When these choke points close, the question stops being about shipping schedules, and it starts being about whether hundreds of millions of people eat at all. The rise of maritime disruption. 25 years of escalation brought us here, and the pattern started in one of the most lawless stretches of water on Earth. Somalia's central government collapsed in 1991, and what followed was illegal foreign fishing, toxic waste dumping off the coast, and the total destruction of local fishing economies. Displaced fishermen turned vigilante, and that vigilante response evolved into organized criminal enterprise, targeting commercial shipping in the Gulf of Aden, a corridor carrying 165,000 vessels a year. By 2007, WFP chartered ships delivering food aid were being hijacked and fired upon, and within 2 years, attacks stretched over 1,000 nautical miles, from the Somali coastline into the deep Arabian Sea. The financial toll in 2011 alone reached between $6.6 and $6.9 billion. Fuel costs from high-speed evasion accounted for $2.7 billion. Multinational naval operations ran $1.27 billion. Security equipment and private armed guards exceeded $1 billion. War risk and kidnap insurance premiums hit $635 million. And rerouting costs added another $486 to $680 million. That level of damage forced the UN Security Council to pass Resolution 1814, which mandated international naval escorts specifically for WFP food convoys. The Black Sea grain blockade. What happened in the Gulf of Aden was non-state actors exploiting weak governance, and that's exactly what makes the 2022 Black Sea crisis structurally different. Russia's invasion of Ukraine severed access to Black Sea ports and landlocked one of the world's largest breadbaskets overnight. Economic costs from the initial shock reached an estimated $116.05 billion across global wheat and corn markets. A UN-brokered Black Sea grain initiative managed to reduce international wheat prices by 7.9%, and offset around $21.48 billion in economic damage. Here's the thing, though. For every ton of wheat successfully shipped from Ukraine to developing countries, a gap of 2 tons remained. That 11.8 million ton deficit matched the annual wheat consumption of 175 million people, roughly the entire population of Bangladesh. Corn exports dropped 41%, barley collapsed by 82%, and sub-Saharan Africa absorbed the worst of it, with global wheat exports falling nearly 7% and West Africa taking 70% of that decline. The Red Sea crisis. And that's when the disruptions moved to a third choke point. Yemen-based Houthi militants launched over 190 attacks by October 2024, deploying drones, anti-ship ballistic missiles, and unmanned explosive vessels across the Red Sea. Maersk and other major carriers suspended transits entirely, which meant Suez Canal traffic dropped 60%, and Gulf of Aden tonnage fell 76%. Rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope added between 6,000 and 11,000 nautical miles, and 10 to 14 extra days to every Asia-Europe voyage. Shipping companies needed 15 vessels instead of 12 to maintain weekly Far East Europe service, and that triggered a cascading 16% capacity reduction on Far East America routes. Schedule reliability plummeted 10 full percentage points, dropping from 62% to 52% in just 2 months. Fuel costs alone surged roughly $1 million per trip. WFP aid shipments heading to Sudan and Yemen were delayed by weeks, and logistics costs jumped 30%. Spot rates from China to the U.S. West Coast spiked 140%, East Coast routes climbed 120%, and Asia to Europe rates surged nearly 5-fold. War risk insurance quadrupled, jumping from $500,000 per voyage before 2023 to $2 million by 2025. the 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis. February 28, 2026 changed everything. U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iranian military and nuclear facilities triggered a retaliatory escalation that no one had modeled at this scale. Iran struck Gulf neighbors and declared the Strait of Hormuz closed, warning that any vessel attempting to pass would be set ablaze. Both the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea corridor shut down simultaneously for the first time in modern history, trapping 170 container ships within days and cutting Hormuz traffic by over 70%. What made this crisis structurally different from every previous one was fertilizer. Middle Eastern urea prices surged 19% within a single week, breaking past $590 per metric ton, while diammonium phosphate hit $655 per ton at the U.S. Gulf. The Hormuz closure didn't just delay grain shipments, it threatened the world's ability to grow food in the first place. Maersk rolled out emergency freight surcharges of $1,800 per 20-foot dry container, $3,000 per 40-foot container, and $3,800 for reefer and special equipment. London reinsurers walked away from war risk coverage entirely, demanding premiums above 200%. None of that mattered to the shipping market, because there was simply no private insurer willing to underwrite the risk. The U.S. government stepped in and ordered the Development Finance Corporation to provide up to $20 billion in political risk insurance for Gulf maritime trade, repurposing a development finance tool as a war risk insurer because the commercial market had ceased to function. Asymmetric warfare goes autonomous. The reason traditional military deterrence failed comes down to economics. By 2026, non-state actors integrated agentic AI into loitering munitions and unmanned explosive boats, creating systems that autonomously plan routes, recognize specific vessel profiles, and execute coordinated swarm attacks without human intervention. A single autonomous drone costing $20,000 can disable a $100 million commercial vessel, and the interceptor missile required to stop it costs upwards of $2 million. China deployed the Liao Wang 1 during the 2026 crisis, a 30,000-ton signals intelligence vessel escorted by guided missile destroyers into the Gulf of Oman, where it established a 6,000-kilometer surveillance envelope, capable of tracking 1,200 missiles and aircraft simultaneously. U.S. Central Command confirmed that Iranian forces inside Yemen were actively feeding targeting data to Houthi rebels, enabling precision strikes against commercial ships. The collapse of humanitarian purchasing power. Against this backdrop, the global humanitarian funding system buckled. The WFP managed over $1.4 billion in procurement across 153 countries in 2024. But humanitarian budgets are locked in by donor nations on annual cycles, which means every spike in shipping and logistics costs translates directly into less food reaching people. 318 million people faced acute hunger, and confirmed famines were declared simultaneously in parts of Gaza and Sudan, a first for the 21st century. The WFP calculated requirements of $13 billion to assist 110 million people in 2026, but aid covered less than half of that, and that's when the largest donor walked away. The United States, responsible for 40% of global aid funding and 46% of WFP contributions, froze foreign aid in February 2025. Executive actions terminated more than 83% of global USAID programming, eliminating $59.7 billion in aid across 130 countries. Britain cut overseas aid from 0.5% to 0.3% of gross national income to fund defense. And Sweden, Switzerland, Finland, France, Germany, and Belgium all followed with their own bilateral cuts. The WFP's 2026 management plan projected just $6.4 billion in contributions against the $13 billion needed. The cascade effect on local economies. Cutting humanitarian aid doesn't just reduce calories, it collapses entire local economies. Researchers tracked 622 refugee households in Kenya's Kakuma camp, a settlement of nearly 300,000 people, over the course of a full year. When aid was slashed, daily caloric intake dropped by 145 kilocalories per person. Households shifted to cheaper and less nutritious food, and the synchronized collapse in spending stripped liquidity from local markets. What nobody expected was the credit system falling apart. Local shopkeepers had been extending credit to refugees based on the anticipated arrival of future aid transfers, using that expected income as informal collateral. Once aid became uncertain, shopkeepers cut off credit entirely, and the most vulnerable families lost their last mechanism for smoothing consumption between deliveries. Aid doesn't just feed people, it backs the entire informal financial architecture of displacement camps. The numbers show how large these economies actually are. Zatari camp in Jordan, with roughly 80,000 Syrian refugees, hosts 2,500 refugee-operated shops and 6,500 cash-for-work positions, generating $13 million a month and over $156 million annually. Kakuma supports 2,100 refugee-owned businesses, with annual household consumption reaching $56 million. Cutting aid by 50% doesn't just halve caloric intake, it wipes out tens of millions in annual revenue for host community wholesalers, transport operators, and local farmers. Food as a weapon. In active conflict zones, food disruption is deliberate. The International Food Policy Research Institute mapped 6 distinct channels through which armed conflict tears apart food systems. Fighting concentrates in rural agricultural areas, which drives farmers and traders out. Those displaced populations flood into small towns without the infrastructure to absorb them, which creates a demand surge, while abandoned fields guarantee future crop failures. Trust-based trading relationships disintegrate because conflict gives everyone a force majeure excuse to break contracts. Extractive black markets rise up, run by military leaders and armed proxies, chasing extreme margins over survival. In South Sudan, humanitarian convoys face taxation at 157 distinct checkpoints, which represents 49% of every mapped checkpoint in the country. Warring factions specifically target roads, ports, fuel depots, grain millers, and electrified warehouses. Research on the dangerously hungry pattern turned up something unexpected. Rebel violence doesn't spread evenly across impoverished areas. It concentrates in zones of relative abundance, pockets of high agricultural potential surrounded by broader scarcity. Armed groups violently seize those remaining food resources to fund their insurgencies, and what were previously stable regions get plunged into manufactured deficits, the fiscal implosion of host nations. Lebanon's real GDP contracted more than 34% over 5 years. Recent conflicts imposed $8.5 billion in combined costs, split between $3.4 billion in physical damages and $5.1 billion in economic losses, with commerce disruptions alone accounting for nearly $2 billion and agricultural destruction reaching $1.2 billion. Tax collection collapsed to 6% of GDP from over 20%, and foreign reserves at the central bank dropped from $36 billion in 2017 to roughly $10 billion. Defunding UNRWA put 250,000 Palestinians at risk, and because UNRWA operates as a parallel state providing education, healthcare, and sanitation, its collapse transfers an unfunded mandate directly to a government that can't pay its own workers. Jordan absorbed 1.3 million Syrians, with more than 80% living in host communities rather than camps. The WFP reduced its beneficiary caseload from 465,000 to 410,000, then cut another 100,000. When USAID funding froze, and that funding historically equaled 3.7% of Jordan's entire GDP, an estimated 35,000 jobs were threatened. Around 43,000 refugees lost primary health care access, and maternal health services for 335,000 women faced elimination. Ethiopia took a direct hit. Over $1 billion in annual USAID funding stopped flowing, stranding food shipments in containers, pausing medicine deliveries to rural clinics, and cutting off thousands of HIV patients from treatment. Macroeconomic projections show that if these cuts hold, Sub-Saharan Africa's economy will shrink by $4.5 billion over 5 years, and 5.7 million additional people will fall below the extreme poverty line by 2030. The early warning blind spot. More than $6 billion in annual humanitarian aid is allocated based on the IPC classification system. A study published in Nature Food examined roughly 10,000 IPC subnational analyses conducted between 2017 and 2023, covering data representing around 1 billion people. The conclusion: the IPC systematically undercounts the severity of food crises, missing approximately 1 in 5 affected people. That undercount is most dangerous at the boundary between Phase 2, labeled stressed, and Phase 3, labeled crisis, because Phase 3 is the exact threshold that triggers emergency funding. Millions of people experiencing early-stage starvation are being statistically erased from the system that is supposed to save them. Building the new architecture. Spot market procurement through predictable sea lanes along stable corridors. That entire model is finished. The WFP's Global Commodity Management Facility shows what the replacement looks like. Buying food in advance during favorable market windows and pre-positioning it in regional hubs cut average delivery times from 120 days to 37, a 69% reduction, while generating $29.7 million in supply chain efficiencies in a single year. In 2020, the GCMF sourced 3.3 million metric tons of food, valued at $1.7 billion, and produced $54 million in direct cost savings. Regional pre-positioning alone shaves an average of 14 days off emergency international procurement timelines. By 2024, 68% of all WFP food, over 1.3 million metric tons, came from local and regional markets, and 54 million of that went directly to smallholder farmers. Cash and voucher assistance costs $5.22 per transfer to deliver, compared to $11.50 for physical food baskets, and every dollar of unconditional cash generates more than $2 in indirect market benefits. Crisis modifiers built into development programs enable instant disbursement the moment a shock hits. Forward contracts lock in commodity prices or freight rates up to 24 months out. The Central Emergency Response Fund processed applications in an average of 1.5 working days in 2023. Anticipatory action frameworks pushed cash out within 48 hours of flood alerts, reaching 6.2 million people in 2024. Artificial intelligence is changing the forecasting side. The World Bank built a model that predicts refugee arrivals 4 to 6 months in advance by analyzing over 90 variables, and machine learning algorithms can now forecast acute food insecurity up to 12 months ahead. A 6-month lag between economic shocks and their transmission into food prices has been mathematically confirmed, which gives governments a measurable window to act before the worst damage arrives. The hard truth. Back in 2008, the global food crisis affected 97 million people, and the international community met 72.5% of funding requirements. In the years that followed, the number of undernourished people dropped by 95 million. Compare that to now. Over 295 million face acute food insecurity. Funding coverage fell to 56% in 2022 and kept declining. Between 2021 and 2022 alone, the number of undernourished people rose by 60 million. Net development funding to fragile states sits lower today than it did in 2009, adjusted for inflation. Open seas can no longer be assumed. The events of 2026 proved that global food security has to be rebuilt from the ground up to survive the closure of waterways that were never supposed to close.